Perhaps the most basic facet of making a successful movie is understanding what the audience wants and then just giving it to them. And while smart filmmakers can subvert audience expectations in a way that's entertaining and still prints money, it's also a tough trick to pull off. It's far more common for directors and studios to tweak a winning formula only for it to backfire spectacularly and end up alienating even those loyal fans who have shown up for every prior installment of the franchise. I'm Cy for Whatculture.com, and these are 10 movies that totally misunderstood their audience. Number 10. The Expendables 3. The first two Expendable movies proved to be solid box office hits because they gave the target audience precisely what they wanted, a bevy of legendary action heroes teaming up to kick ass and take names, with an R rating no less. Yet shortly before the release of The Expendables 3, star Sylvester Stallone revealed that the threequel would be rated PG-13 in an attempt to appeal to a wider audience. Reading between the lines, it felt like Stallone and the series producers wanted to try and transform The Expendables into a more lucrative tentpole franchise on the level of, say, The Fast and the Furious. They figured that by giving The Expendables 3 a more family-friendly audience rating and padding the supporting cast with younger heroes led by Ronda Rousey, the series could become even more of a success. But what a miscalculation that turned out to be. For one, fans of the first two movies were totally alienated by the neutered, mostly bloodless action sequences, and secondly, young people couldn't give a damn about The Expendables. A PG-13 rating and young sidekicks did nothing to change that. Number 9. Jason Goes to Hell, The Final Friday. The 9th Friday the 13th film, Jason Goes to Hell, The Final Friday, was sold to audiences as the absolute end of the series, as much as that means in any horror franchise. Yet Jason Goes to Hell goes about killing off Jason Voorhees for good in the most inane manner possible. Jason ends up being obliterated by an FBI airstrike in the film's opening sequence, after which a coroner eats Jason's still beating heart, allowing Jason to possess that man and live on through him. The rest of the film sees Jason hopping between bodies while the heroes conspire to stab him with a magical dagger which can send him into the depths of hell. Oh boy. The words "nobody asked for this" have perhaps never been more aptly spoken. Fans wanted to see one final Jason Voorhees killing spree before he got decisively offed at the end, not this deeply stupid and at times weirdly boring attempt to do something different right at the finish line. Number 8. The Munsters. Really, what in the blue hell was Rob Zombie thinking with his new adaptation of the legendary 1960s sitcom The Munsters? Really, who the hell was this for? For Rob Zombie fans, The Munsters would surely be too quaint, too sanitised and too PG, while for Munsters fans, the stylistic deviations and uneven performances of the central cast likely denied them much enjoyment. As such, you have a film that doesn't service either of its two primary demographics well at all. It's an aimless, cringe-worthy mess that doesn't even boast basically decent production values or a sensibly brief runtime that might make it tolerable to sit through. Kids and adults alike simply didn't know what to do with this thing, and it's telling that Universal sent it out to die with an extremely low-key direct-to-streaming release. Mr. Zombie, if you'd like to stick to grungy R-rated horror films, that would be appreciated, please. Thank you. Number 7. Terminator Dark Fate. The most insane thing about Terminator Dark Fate is that James Cameron himself worked on the story, and yet it commits the most egregious dramatic sin of the entire series post-Terminator 2. Dark Fate opens by revealing that, 3 years after T2, John Connor was brutally killed by another T-800, leaving his grieving mother Sarah to transform into a Terminator hunting badass. Given that John Connor has been the heart of the franchise since almost the beginning, it was a major gamble to kill him off, and it simply wasn't something most long-suffering fans responded to. Considering that Dark Fate introduced a new John Connor-esque hero, Danny Ramos, to take up his mantle, it seemed blindingly obvious that Cameron and director Tim Miller were basically soft rebooting the series in a deeply cynical and uncreative fashion. Expecting fans to accept Connor's death was incredibly optimistic, especially with him being so blatantly shuffled out of the way to make room for a young new heroine. Unsurprisingly, Dark Fate consequently flopped, with radioactive word of mouth cutting off its box office legs overnight. Number 6. Halloween Ends. Halloween Ends was teed up to be a pretty straightforward conclusion to the Laurie Strode / Michael Myers saga, with Laurie taking on the Shape one more time to avenge her daughter Karen's death at the end of the previous film Halloween Kills. But instead, writer-director David Gordon Green decided to subvert expectations in a most bizarre and deeply polarising way by just not giving fans the movie they wanted. Halloween Ends instead pushes Laurie and Michael to the periphery to focus primarily on an entirely new protagonist, Corey Cunningham, whose arc throughout the film film is divisive, to say the least. Though the final 10 or so minutes circle back to become a more recognisable Halloween movie again, the advertised epic climax between Laurie and Michael was quite the damp squib indeed. Following the vocal fan backlash to the film, Green hilariously responded that he never intended to end his trilogy with a Laurie vs Michael movie, which really tells you everything you need to know. It's not that a subversive, expectation-defying finale couldn't have worked, but asking the audience to buy into a new character they'd never met before, who spends much of his screen time in an unconvincing romance with Laurie's granddaughter, this ain't it, Chief. Number 5. Mortal Kombat. Mortal Kombat Reboot at least had the good sense to deliver the gory R-rated kills that were sorely missing from the earlier live-action movies, but it nevertheless fell down hard in one key area: the hero. Despite Mortal Kombat having an absolute stacked gallery of iconic characters who could serve as the protagonist, the filmmakers decided to centre the story around an entirely original character, an MMA fighter by the name of Cole Young. It's a decision that seemed baffling enough on the surface that many fans assumed that Cole would eventually be revealed as a reimagining of franchise legend Johnny Cage, which turned out to not be the case. One suspects a studio executive felt, as they often do, that the story needed an audience surrogate to help introduce viewers to the world, which is of course complete nonsense. As a result, fans had to suffer through a movie that placed far too much of an emphasis on this random guy we've never met before and his inevitably kidnapped family, when the protagonist could have just as easily been Liu Kang, Johnny Cage, or one of a dozen other popular Mortal Kombat characters. Number 4. Star Wars: The Rise of Skywalker. There are certainly those who feel passionately that Star Wars: The Last Jedi misunderstood its audience, but Rian Johnson's bold attempt to do something new with the series at least brimmed with creativity and intelligence, which can't really be said for follow-up The Rise of Skywalker. Writer-director J.J. Abrams took the completely wrong lessons away from The Last Jedi's divisive fan response, and rather than simply adjust the ongoing narrative trajectory to be a tad more crowd-pleasing, straight up walked back much of what The Last Jedi did. Watching the end product, it's blatantly obvious that Lucasfilm panicked at the polarising reaction to The Last Jedi, and so rather than lean into its boundary-pushing storytelling, simply undid some of the more offensive beats while delivering a narrative that pandered to the most sentimental, regressive quarters of the fanbase. Did anyone really want Palpatine to come back, or Rey to be his granddaughter? So much of what transpired in The Rise of Skywalker felt cynical and unearned, and aside from the Star Wars fans who were satiated with much nostalgia, it was largely met with utter befuddlement. Number 3. The Predator. You know what nobody needed a Predator movie to be? A big budget blockbuster filled with quips, superhero suits, and blatant attempts to build a cinematic universe. Oh, and let's not forget that subplot about weaponized autism, because good God, how was that approved? It's a film that truly believes bigger is better, and so of course feels compelled to introduce a massive CGI upgrade Predator. Unfortunately, a more straightforward film about a team of PTSD afflicted soldiers fighting off a couple of regular sized Predators would have served just fine. It doesn't help that the film feels blatantly chopped to pieces as a result of poor test screenings and ill-fitting reshoots, but it's clear that Fox wanted to try and re-energize Predator as a flashier, even MCU-inspired action franchise, which went down like a lead balloon with fans. Number 2. Ghostbusters: Answer the Call. There was always going to be people who wouldn't give 2016's Ghostbusters a chance because, women, yet on paper the idea of a gender-swapped sequel starring some of the most famous female comedians on the planet seemed like it could actually work. Yet there were a myriad of conceptual problems that showed how little Sony and writer-director Paul Feig actually understood the core appeal of Ghostbusters. The marketing for the film had no idea how to frame the picture, steering away from the word reboot and confusing audiences who thought that it might be a sequel or even a remake, which only upset people further. The depressingly thin script evidently relied way too much on the improvisational talent of its cast, and it's hardly fair to expect them to prop up a $144 million tentpole on the spot. Number 1. Resident Evil: Welcome to Raccoon City. There was a wave of cautious optimism that the recent Resident Evil Welcome to Raccoon City might finally give fans a truly faithful, worthwhile adaptation of the hit survival horror video game franchise. And though it's absolutely hews closer to the games than any prior live-action movie, Welcome to Raccoon City also went in some directions few fans were asking for. For starters, writer-director Johannes Roberts ill-advisedly decided to combine the stories of the first 2 games into one movie, rather than taking the trapped in a mansion setup of the first and focusing on making a straightforward claustrophobic horror film. Many viewers decried that characters had been arbitrarily changed, such as Jill Valentine and Albert Wesker having a romance for some reason, and whilst having so many recognisable faces on screen, not being overshadowed by Mia Jovovich for once was nice, it meant that they were all undercooked by the film's slim runtime. Unsurprisingly, Welcome to Raccoon City flopped at the box office once word got out about what Roberts had done.